Well, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us at the opening ceremony of the very first Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival. My name is Dr. Emily Shelbrough, and I'm the director of Cambridge Zero. The festival is being organised in conjunction with Cambridge University Press, and we partnered with the press to offer a week of live panel sessions, pre-recorded talks, demonstrations, stories, games, and we are all of them are being led by leading thinkers from science, academia, policy, and community groups from around the world. Now, today's opening ceremony is the first of 8 days of free online climate-themed events for all ages. The festival will also include live talks and panel sessions from the likes of British environmentalist and writer Sir Jonathan Porritt, the US Undersecretary for Science Paul M. Dabar, and the Australian Indigenous scholar and writer Tyson Younger-Porter. The festival takes place at the time when the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, was due to take place in Glasgow. Now that, of course, has been postponed now until next year due to the pandemic. The events that you're going to see over the next 8 days cover 5 different themes. Themes of COP26 itself, energy transitions, zero carbon transport, finance, adaptation and resilience, and nature, along with a 6th theme of green recovery. And we saw earlier today a preview of a report that we're going to be launching on Monday of what a green recovery might ought to look like. And each of the 8 days also covers one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So please do join us for as many sessions as you can over the coming week. I know that some of you are joining on this Zoom link and some of you are joining on YouTube, and we are delighted to have you all listening to this opening ceremony today. There are a few house rules that I just want to introduce you all to. Now, if you are accessing this via Zoom, then we're running this in a mode so that we can see all your faces. Could I ask you all to keep yourselves on mute during the event, and you can keep your cameras on, and when we get to questions, then I will come to those of you who would like to ask questions, and then you can. If you want to ask questions, then if you could write your question as a comment in the chat function, if you're on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, if you put your question in the live chat on YouTube, then we'll find all your questions, and at the end of this first presentation, then we will give you a chance to ask your questions. So that does lead us to our first presentation, and it is an absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Emily Grossman. Emily is an internationally acclaimed science author, public speaker, TV personality, best known as science expert on various television shows such as Sky One's Ducks Quack Don't Echo, and for her inspirational talks in schools and universities. She's delivered a TEDx talk on why science needs people who cry, and was named the 2nd honorary STEM ambassador alongside astronaut Tim Peake for her pioneering work in STEM education, and as a role model to young people. Her best-selling children's book, Brain Fizzing Facts, Awesome Science Questions Answered, has recently been shortlisted for the Teach Primary Book Awards 2020. And Emily is also co-founder of the group Scientists for Extinction Rebellion and lead author of their free online guide to the climate and ecological crisis, Emergency on Planet Earth. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Emily here today to open our Climate Change Festival. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction. It's really, really great to be here. I'm very excited to be talking to you all this afternoon. So I'd like to be able to see you all. So Emily, would you mind stopping sharing your screen for a moment so that I can see everybody who's on the call with us? I'll put you all into gallery view and let's get a good look at sort of who we've got here. If you're willing to turn your video on, that would be really lovely, because it'd be nice to just have a little bit of a check-in and a hello and just sort of talk about why we're here. And oh, thanks for the wave. Getting some nice waves. Hi, Scott. Hi, Dalibor. Awesome, lovely way. Thank you. I feel much more relaxed. So I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions. So my first question, and I'm just going to do this by sort of, you can wave or you can thumbs up or however you want to do this. There'll be a point towards the end of the session where you guys can ask questions, as many questions as we have time for. And if there are questions that come up during my presentation, because I'll speak for just over an hour in a moment, but I'll be sort of stopping every now and again to kind of check in. But during that time, if you think of questions, feel free to jot them down or feel free to pop them into the chat box. But I won't be coming to questions until our dedicated session towards the end. And then at that point, we'll get through as many as we can. But during the talk, you can interact in that way if you want to. But for now, I'd like to ask you a question and actually see your faces. So my first question that I'd like to begin with is just to get a feel for who's here. I noticed that we've got some sort of very academic looking people. We've got some families, we've got some teenagers, some kids. Wonderful, lovely, lovely, varied audience, which is perfect. So I'd just like to get a sense of, like, on a scale of like sort of 0 to 10, if we kind of do a sort of hands up and hands down thing, how much do you, Sam, got some giggles there, thank you. How much do you feel that you know, or that you're aware of, that you feel knowledgeable and you get it about what's going on the planet? So, you know, up here, if you're an expert, you know, maybe you're a climate scientist, maybe you've just really kind of got it under your belt, done loads of reading. Down here, if you feel like, you know, really, you know, very, very little at all, and both are fine, and everything in between. I'm loving the faces that come with this. Thanks, everyone. So we've got a real mixture. We've got someone with an up-down, great gesture there. I think that's Claire Jones's little one at the front. Thank you, hello. Okay, great. So that's nice to know. So you should all be reassured that whoever you are right here, right now, there are other people in this audience who are kind of a similar level of experience and knowledge to you. And I will pitch this kind of with a bit something for everyone. So my second question is, in terms of what you do or don't know, regardless of your level of knowledge and awareness, how are you feeling, sort of on a scale of 0 to 10, shall we, in terms of how you're feeling about what's going on the planet, where 0 might be, oh, you know, so fine, it's probably nothing bad really, doesn't really bother me, just here as about a bit of interest, which is fine, no judgment on that. Or up here would be like, oh my God, it's keeping me awake every night, I'm so angry, or I'm overwhelmed, or I'm anxious, or I'm frustrated, or I'm scared, all of those kind of feelings that we might have about the state of the planet right now. So again, let's have some wavy hands, kind of where are you on that sort of up here, down here? So, we've got some, let me just have a little flick through the windows. I can't see many videos, but the ones I can see, okay, we've got a mixture of middles and ups. So we haven't got many right down here, which isn't surprising really, because you've chosen to come to a festival on climate change, conference, whatever you want to call it, and you've chosen to come to this talk. So, you know, I'm sure you have some kind of awareness and concern about what's going on the planet. But remember, as you're listening to this presentation, there might be people in your life around you, friends, family, colleagues, children, parents, who actually don't believe it, who don't take it seriously, who aren't perhaps as concerned as you are. Again, show of hands if you are in agreement with the fact that that is something that's going on in your life, or, you know, show of hands of how concerned you are about the sort of the challenges of having people in your life that perhaps don't get it, perhaps aren't as worried, perhaps aren't taking it as seriously. Great, so again, a really nice mixture. So I invite you, as you listen over the next hour or so, I really invite you to listen from a place of personal awareness in terms of adding to whatever knowledge you have, adding to whatever insight and wisdom or intuition or actual scientific knowledge that you might have. But if some of the stuff that I share you know already, I invite you also to listen with an ear to what can I take away from this to tell others? How can I use this information to better persuade, convince, reassure people in your life who may not be thinking that it's as serious as perhaps you do? How could you use these arguments to even combat skeptics or deniers, perhaps on your social media platforms, perhaps in your classrooms if you're teachers, perhaps around the family dinner table? So I'm inviting you to listen with sort of several different hats on, if you like. And finally, before I get started, I want to just make us aware that what I'm going to be sharing over the next hour or so, some of you may know all this already, but even if you do, what I'm going to be sharing is going to be quite challenging. Even if intellectually we're like, yeah, I get all this. On some level, we're talking about really challenging stuff. We're talking about stuff that might activate you in some way. Perhaps you're already feeling activated. Perhaps it might calm you to know more. But on some level, there might be something going on in your nervous system as you're listening. In fact, it might already be going on right now. So as we listen, you might notice, and before we start, we're just going to do a little bit of breathing together in a second, just to sort of at least start as calm as we can. But as you're listening, you might notice that you start to feel agitated. You might feel your heart rate going up. You might feel your mouth getting dry, your palms getting sweaty, your breathing getting faster. You might feel shaky. You might actually feel a bit numb, a bit spacey. You might start to think about other things and get distracted. That's perfectly natural and perfectly normal. And this is just signs that your stress response, a very healthy response in our body, is getting activated by, quite frankly, in a way that it should be on hearing this kind of information. So I invite you just to be with it, not to judge it. If it feels too much at any point, feel free to just mute me, or feel free to even leave. Maybe come back in when you're feeling a little bit like you want to. But just notice what's going on in your body and just try and breathe into it. Try and take some deep breaths, maybe feel your feet on the floor. A few little tips that we'll go through with you in just a moment, you could bring those in. Because it's very normal when we hear sort of difficult or challenging or overwhelming information like this to have various different stress responses. So the responses I just talked about were kind of like how it might feel in your body. But for some people, that might kind of go further into a sort of fight response. You might have heard of the fight and flight response in the stress response. So you might start to feel angry or frustrated or irritable or annoyed, or you might think, why is she telling me all this stuff? Or why is she wearing that stupid dress? Or, there might be some kind of irritation that comes up. That's perfectly normal. It's okay. Yeah. Don't judge it. Just be with it. And it's fine, whatever you think about me, whenever you're feeling in that, if you want to make some angry comments, maybe don't write them in the chat box, but you can if you really feel you want to. But yeah, angry comments about what's going on, for sure. If you're going to comment on the fact you're angry that your partner hasn't come home and cooked dinner yet, maybe that's slightly different. But so yeah, you might be feeling some anger or frustration. That's your fight response. Equally, you might go into your flight response where you're feeling a lot of fear, a lot of agitation, a lot of panic, anxiety. Again, very natural, very normal. This is your antelope being chased by the lion. It runs away. It gets scared. It kind of gets into overdrive, thinking, trying to solve and analyze mode. That's anxiety and fear, as opposed to the fight response, which is when it tries to fight the lion. And you may also notice that sometimes when we get even more aroused, even more kind of into our stress response, particularly when it feels that actually perhaps there's nothing we can really do about it, or it's even more scary, some of you might notice that you go into a further state, which is known as freeze or overwhelm. And that's like the antelope in the jaws of a lion that kind of just goes, kind of plays dead. It kind of just disappears out of its body. Some people call it numbing or dissociation. Some of us just feel a sense of overwhelm, a paralysis, a sense of shutdown, a sense of it's all too much, a sense of I can't hear anymore, can't really form thought processes. Again, that's very healthy response to what is quite a frightening situation. So again, I invite you to zone out if you need to, come back into your body, do some breathing, and just check in with yourself, whatever that means to you. If you want to just go and have a cup of tea or whatever, remember this is being recorded, so you can watch any bits that you miss later. And as that's happening, I just invite you to notice that these reactions in your body are very normal, very healthy. And you might also be noticing these reactions, or might have noticed these reactions in the people around you, in your communities, your colleagues, your friends, your family. In response to the information that we know about the planet, some people want to get on the streets and fight. Some people want to write to their MP. Some people want to shout a lot. Some people want to get angry with their partner or their children. That's a normal response. Some people might get very frightened and be agitated and want to run all over the place and do a million things at once, or think about everything but the climate crisis. That's also very natural and very understandable. They might want to just jet off on a plane to Timbuktu, not that we can right now. Or someone around you or yourself might be feeling anxious and overwhelmed and shut down, like you really want to do something, but you just haven't got the energy. You're exhausted. you're confused, you don't really know where to put yourself, perhaps you don't even want to get out of bed. That's a very common reaction. And if you start to feel like this in this call, or if you know other people, it's just a reassurance that this is your nervous system working in a healthy way, and that it's okay to just not have to solve it, not have to do anything about it yet, and just for a time, look after yourself. In this call, look after yourself, breathe, you know, put some nice blanket around you, go and have a cup of tea. You don't have to get on the front line and fix all this, or inform about this, or do all the activism stuff, or all the communication stuff right now. There are other people who can be doing that. So before we start then, let's just take a couple of moments to take some deep breaths, because some people might already be feeling a little bit just from this. And also I tend to talk quite fast, so that also might kind of ramp people up a little bit. So, you know, just bear that in mind and slow things down if we need to. So just a few little tips as to how you can do this throughout the talk, and we'll just do it now, right now, is first of all, we're just going to take some deep breaths together. Now that might sound really simplistic and silly and like it's not a yoga class, blah, 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 but it's actually scientifically shown that if we breathe for longer, it actually tricks our body, as in breathe more slowly. It tricks our body into thinking that we're safe. We are actually safe right now, but our brains might be telling us we're not. And actually, if we breathe longer on the out breath than the in breath, that actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So it calms down the fight-flight response. So we're going to have a go at that now. So we're just going to do some deep breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. And we're going to breathe slightly longer on the out breath. So we'll breathe in for 5, hold for 2, and breathe out for 7. So just give it a go, in through the nose, out through the mouth. So we breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, and out through the mouth, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and again, in, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, and out through the mouth, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now you may already feel a little calmer. If you don't, that's okay too. I'd now like to invite us just to take a moment to make sure you're sitting comfortably. Ideally, both feet on the floor or sitting evenly on your bottom cheeks. Relax your shoulders, relax your jaw, open your chest slightly. And I'd like you to just see if you can feel your feet on the floor, or your ankles on the chair, or your bottom on the chair. Just bring your awareness just for a moment into the parts of your body that are connected with the ground, the chair, the seat, something solid. Just bring your awareness to there. Okay. So I've had a comment which is not very helpful. So we'll get on with it in just a moment. Okay. So let's feel our feet on the floor, feel our bottom on the chair, and just take a moment to relax into ourselves. It's very important that we do this. I know lots of people think, oh, let's just hear the information. I understand that. There's a bit of a fight response coming out, I suspect. Frustration, irritation, and anger. I get that. And yes, some people do want to go straight on into this, but actually hearing about this stuff without actually having an awareness of our body and our regulation and how to regulate ourselves means that we can't actually go out into the world afterwards and be effective. Trust me, I know this. I've spent a lot of the last year and a half in a nervous system state of total overwhelm, and it hasn't been helpful. So when we hear information, it's important that we ground it in our bodies and that we work out from a grounded place how we want to act on this, what our next move is, and what to do next. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me, for those of you who might have found that uncomfortable. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharing my screen in just a moment. Let me do this. So share screen, here we go. And that should share my presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my presentation now. I invite you to, if you can see me on the screen, that's great, so you can see me talking, but I also invite you to move it to the sort of bottom right of the screen rather than top right, because a lot of the graphs I'm going to be showing necessarily go whoop and have a little uptick on the right edge, and it's the right edge you want to see. So I suggest moving me to the bottom left. Okay, so David Attenborough most recently, not most recently, said lots of things recently, but relatively recently said, we are facing a man-made disaster on a global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years. So I want to start by telling you how, or by sharing with you, how I came to be sitting here today talking to you about the climate and ecological crisis. Now, if any of you know much about my career, until a year and a half ago, I knew absolutely nothing. I'm going to put my hands up here and say I knew absolutely nothing about climate change and the ecological crisis. Now, that's slightly underselling myself. You know, I did a degree in natural sciences. I did a PhD in molecular biology. Of course, I've studied some chemistry, some biology, and I understood about climate change even from school. But relatively speaking, I knew very, very little. And I want to tell you that because I want to tell you, first of all, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've spent the last year and a half going on a deep dive to find out everything I could about what's going on the planet, from a place of knowing very little, because the whole point is, unless you're a climate scientist, it's very hard to actually really know what's going on and what's true and what to believe. So it all started for me about a year and a half ago, April 2019, when I attended the second Extinction Rebellion protests, simply to support my partner, Kim Wei, who's also on this call, who was leading and playing in the samba band. Now, I went along to the protests, being a sort of diligently supportive partner. Kim Wei's pronouns are he, him, by the way, so I'll refer to him as he, but you can see he's assigned female at birth, just to avoid confusion. So he and I went along to the rebellion. Kim Wei was drumming. He was also singing songs on the pink boat in the middle of Oxford Circus. And I was kind of being a very supportive partner, but also thinking, goodness me, like, what am I doing here? What is going on? And quite frankly, I felt really uncomfortable because I was looking around and I was seeing banners and placards and people shouting, you know, a mass extinction and societal collapse and civil unrest, and we need to change the course of history now, and millions or billions of people might die. And I'm thinking, really? I feel very uncomfortable here. Is it really that bad? So given that I'm a science communicator, given that I've got a relatively big public platform and following on social media, there was no way that I was about to start talking about my being at the protests, even just being there, without really getting to the bottom of like whether it was really as bad as all that. And honestly, my instinct was like, nah, it can't be. It can't be that bad, for three reasons. Number one, I thought if it was really that bad, then surely it would be on the front page of every newspaper. It would be top of the bill on every news report. And it isn't. So quite frankly, nah, I don't believe it. They must be alarmism. They must be kind of making a big song and dance about this. My second reason was that I thought, okay, if it really is that bad, and even if the media aren't telling us, surely the government knows. And surely if the government knows, then they would be doing something about it. So maybe it is that bad, but they're on it. How naive I was. And my third reason was a bit more personal, which was, as I've sort of mentioned, I'm a science communicator. I've dedicated my life to finding out the truth about the world, to getting to know what's right and what's wrong, and to communicating that truth to people. I'm also autistic, so I have a real desperate sense and desire to speak the truth, to find out the truth, to speak the truth. I can't lie, and to kind of get underneath, you know, what people are saying. So I thought, you know, given that I've dedicated my life to this and I've given tons of talks on different science topics across the world, no one's asked me to give a talk on climate change. I'm not saying there haven't been people giving talks, but I was just like, it's not really on my radar. And arrogantly, I thought, well, if it's not really on my radar, it can't really be that much of a big deal because somebody would have asked me about it. Again, how naive I was. So what I decided to do, literally on that day, I was like, okay, if I'm going to even be seen at this protest, let alone get on board with it, then I need to make sure that I really find out the truth about what's going on. So from that day, I started to go on my own sort of special interest, shall we say, deep dive into finding out what's going on the planet. And, you know, I've done a PhD, I've been a research scientist, I know how to research information. I will say that, you know, I know which sources to read, which journals to read, which experts to speak to. There were already some great climate scientists who were on board with Extinction Rebellion, a few who are on this call today, who were there to talk to, who gave me so much of their time. I was asking them questions, getting them to explain stuff, saying, well, is it really that? So I knew how to find stuff out. And the more I read, the more I researched, the more horrified and the more terrified I became. And I can honestly say I have not had a single good night's sleep since. Because what I found as I read and expanded my knowledge was that not only were the things on these placards, the things the activists were saying, not only were they true, but actually things were, if possible, even worse. That there was a lot that wasn't being said, that hasn't been talked about. And it became this obsession of mine. I was like, I have to get my own head around the truth. And I have to make sure that as many people out there as possible know the truth. Of course, there's lots of other people out there trying to get the truth out. I'm not on my own on this one. But I just knew from that moment that the only thing that had any integrity in my life was trying to find out everything I could and trying to get it out there. So what I'm going to do for the next bit of the talk is give you an overview of what it is that I found, to get combined with some brilliant experts, climate scientists and ecologists from the Extinction Rebellion community, what it is that I found with their help, a summary of what I see as the most important things for people to know about what's going on the planet, why, where we're heading, and what we can all do to help. So the first thing to share is that if you look at this graph here, I won't be showing too many graphs, so hopefully they'll be quite simple ones for anyone to understand, is that these are the global temperatures over the last 150 years or so. 150 years is chosen as the sort of the period that we tend to look at, because that's the around the beginning of the, well, middle of the Industrial Revolution, which is when things really started to change. And as you can see, the colour stripes show us that, excuse me, the last 4 years have been the hottest on record. 19 of the hottest 20 years on record have been in the last 20 years. And there is absolutely no doubt that temperatures, global temperatures, are rising. You can see here that this graphic shows temperatures, how things have changed in the last sort of 10 years or so. And you can see pretty universally that the temperatures have gone up. Now I say pretty universally because it's obviously important. We're talking about average changes. There will be parts of the globe that have got colder. Lots of skeptics always say, oh, it got colder where I live. Well, yes, of course, we're talking about global averages. You have to look at long-term trends. Short-term change, that's the weather. Of course, some places are suddenly a bit colder. Some places some areas of the world are actually colder in a given year than the year before. But if you look at the long-term trend, you know, there's dips and troughs, dips and troughs. If you look at the long-term trend, global temperatures on average are going upwards on the majority of parts of the world, particularly at the poles for a variety of reasons, and that's particularly problematic. And if we look at this in context, again, you're going to need the right-hand side of the screen here. If we look at this in context, if we look at the last 2,000 years, you can see that temperatures have gone up and down. You can see these squiggly lines. If you look at the invention of the steam engine down sort of bottom right, that was around 1800s, Industrial Revolution. And then our temperatures just start to absolutely skyrocket. Now, I say skyrocket, they've actually only gone up by about 1 degree. You can see that, right? But if you look relative to the fluctuations that there were before, that really is a lot. And in fact, our global temperatures are higher now. It's almost certain they're higher now than they have been at least the last 100,000 years. That's a long time. And the point is they're going up very, very fast. Now, 1 degree C may not sound like very much, but averaged over the whole of the globe, to get the amount of heat in our atmosphere to raise the temperature by 1 degree, that's an awful lot of heat, you know? And 1 degree is actually the equivalent of 5 atomic bombs going off in our atmosphere every second. That's the equivalent heat energy that's being released into our atmosphere that has caused, today that is, that over the last 150 years averaged out has caused a rise in 1 degree. Remember, 1 degree as well can mean the difference between water and ice. You know, 1 degree in this context is a lot. So The next question people tend to ask is, okay, so yeah, fine, temperature's going up, but so what? You know, maybe it's something natural that's going on. Can we really be sure it's humans? Well, yes, we can. And let me just give you some arguments to combat skeptics on this topic. It is unequivocal now, but if you're still not sure, here's just a little bit of background basic climate science. Forgive me if this is kind of too simple and very known by a lot of people here, but some background climate science because it helps us understand how we know for sure that the rise in temperatures is due to us. So first of all is that the sun shines its heat on the earth heats up, and the earth radiates that heat back out to space. Luckily, we have a layer of gases around the earth called greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, that help trap some of the heat radiating from the earth and keeps us warm. We need that layer. That fluffy blanket keeps us warm at night, otherwise we'd all be too cold and we'd die. However, we also know that these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that make up the fluffy blanket are increasing. In other words, the blanket is getting thicker. Now, some people say, okay, well, if we're getting hotter, maybe it's not the blanket getting thicker, maybe it's because there's extra activity from the sun. That's a common argument from skeptics. No, if we look at the graph, solar activity kind of goes up and down a little bit, but the global temperatures scoop up like that. And in fact, what we can see is that instead, the increase in global temperatures over the last 100 years or so is mirrored by the increase in carbon dioxide, one of those key greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Another thing that people often say is, well, you know, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, maybe that's due to natural causes. Maybe that's nothing to do with us. Maybe we should just follow what the Earth is naturally doing. Well, okay, look at this graph. So this graph shows carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. Carbon dioxide levels go naturally up and down, partly driven by the sun's natural variations in its orbit. The Earth's natural variations in its orbit around the sun, known as Milankovitch cycles. The point is that causes changes through a variety of knock-on effects, causes changes in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So yes, there are natural changes, but look at them going up and down over the last 800,000 years. That's what drives the Earth in and out of the ice ages, because when carbon dioxide levels go down, the thickness gets, the fluffy blanket gets thinner, so we're not as warm, and we get colder, we go into the ice age, and then we come out. So yes, that is very natural, Earth's natural cycles, that does happen. But look what's happened on the right. So our global carbon dioxide levels now are not only higher than any time in the last 800,000 years, but also any time in the last 3 million years. Plus, our natural cycles should actually be sending us towards our next ice age in the next 1,500 years or so, not hotter, which is what we're getting. Plus, we're getting hotter, we are getting hotter, but our carbon dioxide levels are increasing at a rate today hundreds of times faster than any of the natural increases that took us in and out of the ice ages. So anyone who says, oh, it's just Earth's natural cycles, absolutely categorical, it is not. Show them this graph. Okay, so one more piece of evidence that kind of nail in the coffin really is that there is now actually a human fingerprint on climate change, which shows that the carbon dioxide is coming from fossil fuel burning, which has been happening in huge quantities since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The burning of the fossil fuels releases lots of energy, which is great for industry, also releases carbon in the form of carbon dioxide that's been trapped in the fossil fuels that were formed millions of years ago deep under the oceans and under the rocks. And that carbon dioxide has been shown to be the same carbon dioxide that's now adding to our atmosphere, making the fluffy blanket, the greenhouse gas layer, get thicker. And it's been shown that it's that greenhouse layer that is trapping more heat through satellite data. It's been shown through isotopes that it's the same carbon. So it is absolutely certain now that it is this carbon coming primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, but also lots of other ways, which I'll come back to, that is thickening the blanket, that is making our atmosphere warmer. Absolutely no doubt about it. And it's not the only greenhouse gas. We'll talk about some others in a moment. So, you know, according to the top experts, in just 100 years, fossil fuel use has undone more than 5,000 years of natural cooling. Remember, we should be cooling. We should be going towards an ice age. It's hotter now than any time in the history of human civilization, and we're catapulting ourselves out of the Holocene, which is the climactic sort of stable climate period we've been in for the last 12,000 years or so, or maybe a bit less, since the last ice age kind of thing. Well, 12,000 years since last ice age. We've been in the Holocene probably about 5,000 years, I believe. But it's catapulting us into uncharted territory, into now what is called the Anthropocene, the era that is being controlled by human action, where the climate is being controlled by human action. So what's going to happen? What is happening already, and what's going to happen as a result of all this extra heat in the atmosphere? Well, the first thing, which is pretty obvious, but I'll take you through the science of it, because again, there's some people who kind of might doubt some of this, is more extreme weather. We've actually seen that the climate has already changed. Climate change has already changed our weather patterns and is having adverse effects on people's lives. So since the 1990s, the number of disasters, specifically here extreme weather events, has doubled from the 1990s going up to 2010. And more recent data that I haven't got a graph of shows that from 2010 till this year, in the last decade, it's almost doubled again. So we're talking storms, wildfires, extreme heat, droughts and floods. Now, a lot of people might think, okay, well, it's obvious that if our global temperatures are getting warmer, 1 degree, that's not very much. But the point is we get more extremes. So we get extreme heat. So we get areas of the globe, including the UK, including Europe, but particularly in parts of the global south and in less developed countries, this is extreme heat in Kenya. And extreme heat then leads to droughts. So this is in Kenya, we've had where there's been horrible droughts in the past. In Ethiopia, this is in Laos, and even here, this is actually a picture taken here in London. I say here, I'm not in London, but some of you might be, of extreme heat causing real distress in major cities around the world. So this is already happening. Thousands of people are dying every year in this country from heat stress, from particular heat waves. And it's been shown, there's been lots of attribution studies to show that heat waves are made 10, 20, 50, 100, 600 times more likely due to climate change. And this is now well documented. It's not just like, oh, it might be. It absolutely is being made more frequent. It's going to happen more and more often because of climate change. And of course, we don't just have heat-related deaths, but we also have heat-related diseases. It exacerbates asthma and lung diseases and all sorts of other challenges that come with the heat. But it's not just heat that happens. Of course, when you get extra heat, the soils dry out, the trees and the vegetation dries out. So you get hot areas, don't just get hotter, but they also get drier, because when it's hot, clouds can't form as easily. Very simple physics. So you're more likely to get forest fires. Yes, actually most of this has been debunked, but some of them might have been started by arson. Mostly actually they weren't. But even ones that are started by arson, the point is they spread faster. They spread quicker, they spread faster, and they spread more. So this is a fire actually quite a while ago in California, but the forest fires in California this summer, they've now been called, what are they called? They were called mega fires, and now they're called, gosh, it's just gone out my brain. But the fires are now covering 1 million acres this year, which means that there's a new classification of fires required. 5 of the 20 biggest fires in California have taken place this year. And these are happening more and more because of climate change, because of the drying of the soil, because of the hotter temperatures means that the fires can spread. There's of course been terrible fires in Australia and in many other parts of the world. In the fires in Australia last year, it's estimated that 1 billion animals, creatures, and I think that's actually only mammals, were lost. Insects and other creatures, huge load more. And of course, we're losing the habitats of animals, and I'll come back to wildlife loss in a moment. So this is absolutely linked to climate change. But then of course, not of course, I'll explain why, we also get floods. This is in Indonesia. In fact, I'll show you some more pictures in a moment, but let me just explain for a moment. So why does extra heat in the atmosphere cause more rain? Well, very simple physics. Rain is caused by evaporation from the oceans. The evaporation is driven by heat in the atmosphere. Water in the oceans evaporates. We get more water vapor in the atmosphere when it's hotter because there's more evaporation. Also, when it's hotter, the air can hold more water vapor. It can hold 7% more water vapor per degree. So you get more water vapor in the air. What this means is that when the conditions are right for clouds to form, either it rises high enough or the temperature cools down enough, those clouds that form, there's going to be more of them, and they're going to be thicker, and clouds can be thicker, but they're going to be more dense, and the rainfall is going to be heavier and more intense and more frequent in the areas where rain was forming before. So areas that are already wet are going to get wetter, plus, or are getting wetter, I should say. Plus, we've got the fact that scientists think that the extra heat in the atmosphere might also be interfering with the jet stream, which is something that drives our weather cycles. And the jet stream is being made to go a bit more wavy rather than more straight through, which means that weather systems linger for longer, which means when you get an extreme heat wave, it lasts for longer. When we get extreme rainfall leading to floods, it lasts for longer. There's more downpours for a longer period of time, leading to far more chance of flooding. So we've got terrible floods over the last few decades, getting more and more frequent. These ones are Indonesia, some really heart-wrenching pictures of people struggling. We've got typhoons in the Philippines. So it's not just floods, it's also tropical storms become more likely with more heat in the atmosphere. The tropical storms whip up more water from the oceans, they dump more water, they're more destructive, typhoons, hurricanes, etc. This is Haiti. Some really moving pictures from the devastation in Haiti from storms. This is landslides in Peru as a result of heavy rainfall. We've also got flooding in New Orleans. This is just some examples over the last sort of recent years. And in America, they're actually finding, this is in South Dakota, they've actually found that this year in 2020, there've been so many hurricanes that they've run out of names. So they've actually had to gone through all 21 names through the alphabet. They only used 21 letters, and they've had to start again. And it's only the second time that that's ever happened because there've been that many hurricanes. And it's not just far-flung parts of the world. There are many cases, these are all cases here in the UK, of floods which have been made more likely, significantly more likely, or even impossible in the absence of climate change. Places like Yorkshire, Gateshead, Northumberland. This is in Cornwall, in Fowey in Cornwall. This is in Buckinghamshire. So it is happening on our doorstep. And the point is, if we listen to the experts, it's going to get worse. These records will be broken in a few years. We had, in 2016 was the hottest year ever so far. I think it may be moving towards 2020, I'm not sure yet. 2019 had the hottest month ever recorded, July 2019. There were nearly 400 temperature records broken in 2019. That's a lot of temperature records. This year, 2020, we've had the warmest January, we've had the wettest February, we've had the warmest May, we've had the warmest the wettest October, we've had the warmest September. We had a month's worth of rain in one day in October. So much rain that it could fill Loch Ness in one day in October in the UK. There's records being broken everywhere, and it's going to get worse. We're going to start to see the extreme end of the fire behaviour scale getting even worse. And we're going to see many more Hurricane Harveys of that type in the future, and possibly even here in Europe and in the UK. So the point is, it's happening. It's happening already in other places. It's happening to some extent here and in Europe, and it's going to get worse. And just because it's the poor that are suffering today in the global south and in less developed countries, necessarily, even if we're heartless and we don't care about it happening not on our doorstep, it will happen here. The rich will suffer tomorrow. So world leaders should be listening to the scientists. They should be listening to the people who are struggling with extreme weather events right now, because humanity won't be able to cope with what we're heading for. So what are the other effects of the extra heat in our atmosphere? So another obvious one is melting ice and rising seas. So we see that as the temperature has risen, the sea levels have also risen. Now that's twofold. First of all, as the temperatures rise, ice melts. And of course, as ice melts, we have huge problems for creatures that live on the ice. It's a bit of a poster child for climate change, but the polar bears, if we allow all the ice loss to continue, which it is doing, all the polar bears will soon be gone. But it's not just polar bears. It's all the other parts of the world that are covered in ice that need that ice. So for example, we're losing glaciers. There's 1.9 billion people across the globe that depend on freshwater glaciers for their drinking water and for crop irrigation. We're losing those glaciers. We're losing land sheets on Antarctica and on Greenland. This is a dried out glacier in Austria. So we're losing, as we lose sea ice, then polar bears can't hunt. But in terms of sea level, that doesn't make a difference because the sea ice just melts into the sea. The problem is when we lose land ice, so that's Greenland, Antarctica and the glaciers, which we are losing at a terrifying rate, the amount of ice that we're losing on our planet, if we average it out over the last 40 years, it's the equivalent of losing 300 double-decker bus-sized chunks of ice every second. That's how much ice we're losing. Yeah, to me, that's absolutely astonishing and terrifying. The point is we're losing it really fast, and that is going to cause knock-on effects, because the other knock-on effect of losing land ice, like glaciers and ice sheets, is that ice melts and goes into the oceans and causes the sea levels to go up. Plus, as the oceans get hotter, the water expands, it's more basic physics, and the sea levels go up. The point is we are seeing sea level rise. The impacts of sea level rise is already happening. It's already devastating local communities, coastal and river communities, and it is going to get worse. The impact on families is going to be enormous, particularly in areas such as the Gulf Coast and areas in the UK that are around the coast, that are around our river estuaries, that are moving towards the point at which they're going to be below sea level at high tide. And there's some areas of the country that are already like that. This is the Marshall Islands that are already being lost to sea level rise. It's predicted they're going to be disappeared by the end of the century. And it's not just far away things. This is in Norfolk, on the beach in Norfolk, and we've got houses are literally crumbling into the sea due to erosion, due to sea level rise, due to storms. It's interconnected crises that are all happening due to, well, erosion is also partly natural, but the sea level rise and the extra floods and storms are also added to by human action. In addition, the extra heat in the atmosphere heats up the oceans, doesn't just cause the oceans to expand, but it causes the life in the oceans to diminish. So, for example, fish and creatures living in the oceans are suffering from marine heat waves, which kills a lot of the ocean life. Plus, extra heat in the oceans causes the oxygen dissolved in the oceans to actually, a lot of it to come out of solution. So we're getting areas of the oceans that are low in oxygen, which means that, again, sea creatures can't live there, what's called ocean dead zones. Plus, particularly to do with the coral reefs, which you can see here, the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels can dissolve in the oceans, making the oceans more acidic. So they're supposed to be alkaline, they're still alkaline, but not as alkaline. They're 30% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution. And that's causing catastrophic damage, because sea creatures living in the oceans require the alkalinity to form their shells. In a slightly more acidic conditions, the shells just start to dissolve. So coral reefs, sea snails, oysters, clams, their shells are literally dissolving. And we depend on these creatures, partly because they're the bottom of the food chain. 1 million different species depend on coral reefs, but also there's 1 billion people across the planet that depend on coral reefs themselves for protection from storms, for tourism, for fishing, for food, for their livelihoods. These are not just beautiful things in the ocean, these are things that we depend on. So that brings me on to what are the knock-on effects of these devastating impacts that we're seeing already. So everything is connected, and it's very, very complex. One thing affects the other, which then feeds back and affects something else. But the bottom line is that climate change impacts everything. Everything sort of is damaged, affected, impacted by changes in our weather systems. So, for example, and there's so many examples, I'm just going to go through a couple, access to food and water. So it's really clear that climate change is already causing reduced crops, reduced nutrition in crops, reduced crop harvests. There's the last 2 years, the last 2 out of the last 3 years have had really severely reduced harvests here in the UK, but we can't see it so much because we import a lot of our stuff. So it hasn't really, the impacts haven't really shown up yet, but they will. And the point is that as areas across the globe get hotter, there's droughts, there's more floods, then the areas that are producing crops are more and more likely to fail, and some of them are already failing. So we know that with increased storms and floods and droughts and heat waves, production of food will be more problematic. Production of nutritious food will be more problematic, and that's already happening. Plus, access to clean, safe drinking water will become more difficult. And it's the head of the Met Office has said that he finds it hard to see how the population of the world will be able to feed itself if we allow things to keep on going as they are. And the former president of the World Bank has said that climate change will lead to battles for food. We've also got impacts on health. So apart from heat-related illnesses, which are in the thousands just in the UK, tens of thousands of people dying from prematurely due to heat waves across Europe in some of the big heat waves over the last decade. But there's also other impacts. Climate change poses the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. Why? Because not only do floods and storms and heat waves and extreme weather damage and kill people, but also increasing global temperatures cause the bacteria that spread diseases to be able to thrive better. So it's more likely that they're going to be passed on from person to person. And we're already seeing outbreaks of diseases that have otherwise been eradicated, such as malaria, outbreaks in parts of the world where it was eradicated, such as malaria coming back in Europe. There've been incidences of Zika virus in this part of the world. So, and this is directly linked to increases in global temperatures, to changes in the seasons, to changes in the migration and the proximity to humans of animals, because that brings me on to the obvious thing, pandemics. So there's a lot of evidence now to show that the COVID-19 pandemic was passed from bats to humans, and I think possibly via pigs, but it's not certain. But the point is that pandemics are far more likely to happen because of the fact that humans are intermingling more with animals, because we're kind of cutting our way into animals' habitats. I'll come to animals in a moment, but that means that we're mingling with animals. That means we're more in close proximity with animals, which means that animals are more likely to pass diseases on to other animals and then on to humans. So there's a variety of reasons why human health is threatened directly and indirectly by climate change. And it is particularly impactful on the elderly and on children. And these are the people that are the most vulnerable that we really need to protect. Another knock-on effect is migration and displacement. So the civil war in Syria, lots of complex factors as to why that came about, but there's a lot of evidence now to show that climate change played a role in it. And this is Syrian refugees in Hungary trying to get to Germany, not being allowed on the trains. And in the first 6 months of 2019, a record 7 million people were displaced due to climate impacts and extreme weather. So, we're going to see a lot more displacement. And if we imagine what that's going to do to the stability of our society, to human rights, this is something that's already happening, and we're going to have more of it. So that brings me on to what else we're doing to our planet. It's not just what we're doing in terms of carbon dioxide release from fossil fuels and planes and cars and trains, but it's also a huge impact is deforestation. We've now lost around half the trees that we had at the start of agriculture. That's about 3 million trees. And we're losing about 15 billion every year. In parts of the Brazilian rainforest, trees are being felled at the rate of 3 football fields every minute of Amazon rainforest being lost. Now, deforestation, first of all, we lose the habitats of animals, which is hugely important to maintain the balance of our ecosystems on the planet, which I'll come to in a second. But also, trees are a very important way of trapping carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The more that we chop them down, the more our greenhouse gas layer is going to get thicker because they can't get trapped by the trees. And in fact, when you burn the trees, it actually releases that carbon back into the atmosphere. So it gets even worse. So deforestation to feed the planet's ever-increasing demands for palm oil and for food products and for grazing and for livestock and for agriculture, this is a huge, huge problem. And it feeds into climate change. It's a sort of feedback loops. We've also got intensive agriculture. So we've got the fact that we're using up more and more of our land to grow crops, but particularly for livestock. Livestock is the absolute biggest problem, because farming livestock and actually farming crops using monoculture, so intensive agriculture, churns up the soil. And when we churn up the soil gets damaged and degraded. We've now lost about a third of our soils across the planet in terms of damage and degradation. Not only does that mean it's harder to then grow more crops in the future, but also that soil actually contains a lot of carbon. And as we damage the soil, the carbon gets released back into the atmosphere, even more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's all just kind of like ramping up as we go. Also with intensive agriculture, we have chemical fertilizers. Fertilizers release nitrous oxide, which is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, even more potent than carbon dioxide. And then when we farm livestock, cows and sheep are ruminants, and they burp and fart methane. And cows burp and fart enormous quantities of methane. And methane is another very potent greenhouse gas. So not only that, but actually even though 80% of our farmland is used for farming livestock, it only produces less than 20% of our calories and only about a third of our protein. So it's a very, very inefficient way of using the land, not to mention all the methane that gets burped out, plus all the fossil fuels to drive the tractors and the compaction of the earth from the tractors. It's damaging our soil, it's damaging the environment. And of course we have to eat, but this is a particularly inefficient use of land. And we could free up an enormous amount of land if we switched away from big agriculture and if we switched away from livestock farming. And experts have said that actually going vegan is the single biggest way that we can reduce our impact on the planet. That's a very contentious issue, I'm aware of that, but it's definitely something to think about. Another issue that we're doing is that we're creating is pollution, both in our waters. We all know about plastic pollution in the seas and how absolutely devastating that is for sea life, but also pollution in the air. There's an air pollution pandemic. An estimated nearly 4 million people die every year as a result of outside air pollution. Just wanted to get that figure out. Around 4 million people every year as a result of outside air pollution. 9 out of 10 people on this planet breathe polluted air. In London alone, 24 people die every day due to air pollution. So this is another linked in impact that we're doing to our planet, mostly from chemicals from car exhausts and from transport and from burning fossil fuels in factories. Not just that, but that's a large part of it. So that brings me on to wildlife. We're losing our wildlife at catastrophic rates. Now, this is a mixture of climate change, which is causing wildlife to have to migrate to different areas because it's getting too hot or too dry or too wet for where they normally live. Also because of changes in the seasons, because of changes in the weather systems means that the seasons are starting early or later in different parts, so wildlife has to migrate. And the problem is that there's nowhere for a lot of these creatures to go because so much of our planet is degraded by human action. They try and get somewhere colder, they try and go up a hill, or they try and go further north, and there just isn't anywhere for them to go. They've been cut off, or those areas have been degraded. Plus, damage to wildlife comes from pollution, comes from chemical fertilizers, pesticides, it comes from habitat loss and destruction of natural habitats. And we're actually, if we continue to lose the wildlife as we're doing, even the smallest organisms that we're losing, we destabilize and ultimately risk collapsing the world's ecosystems. So our vertebrate population sizes are now down 60%. In fact, the recent figure is now showing 68%. So it's increasing as well. Numbers are going down. That's a staggering loss of vertebrate population sizes. 1 in 4 species are now at risk of extinction. And there's 1 million species that are now threatened with extinction, many of which over the coming decades, unless we take radical action, and we take it now. The UK is one of the most nature depleted and nature challenged parts of the world. 1 in 4 British mammals also at risk of extinction now. And when we have changes to our animals, it impacts us in many ways. So this is an example of crops rotting where because of changes in the climate, parrots came in at a different time of year than usual, and they fed off the crops when the crops were supposed to be being harvested. There's many ways in which animals impact our crop life, and particularly is through insects. We can't survive without insects, and there is a staggering loss of insects going on this planet, again, for all the reasons that I mentioned. Insects are particularly important because they pollinate our crops, and 95% of what we eat relies on healthy soil. We're losing our soil, like I said, and we're losing our insects that pollinate those crops that allow them to grow. And we also rely on small creatures like earthworms to replenish the soil when it does get degraded, but we've now lost about 80% of our earthworms, so we can't replenish the degraded soil either. Then we look at what's happening in the oceans. I already talked about what's happening in terms of climate, in terms of heat, but also we've got to look at overfishing. About a third of the fisheries are now overfished across the oceans of the world, and that's going to cause dramatic shifts in ecological structures with concerning implications for humans who depend on the ocean. And in fact, we're losing our wildlife so fast that experts now say that we're entering the 6th mass extinction. Extinctions have happened in the past, a long time ago, but this time it's our fault. And that's because of how fast, not just how many creatures we're losing, but how fast we're losing them. We're now losing creatures up to 1,000 times the background rate, so 1,000 times faster than we should be losing species in terms of natural species loss. Nature is declining at rates unprecedented in human history, and it's going to have grave impacts on people around the world. So there are many different environmental bodies, scientific bodies who have told us that we're eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health and quality of life, that we're causing the fabric of life to unravel. These are very solid, standardized scientific bodies that are issuing these reports, well-respected, high reputable sources. So this brings me to the sort of penultimate section. What is going to happen next? So the thing is, nobody really knows is the bottom line, but we do know an awful lot. So first of all, we know that at our current rates of greenhouse gas emissions, we're supposed to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? Everybody knows we're supposed to be getting down to net zero by 2050. We are not. They are still rising. And at the moment, we're heading for not just a 1 degree rise, which is where we are now, but for a 1.5 degree rise since the Industrial Revolution by 2030. Remember, this is a time where we're supposed to be decreasing our greenhouse gas levels and therefore decreasing or at least stabilizing our global temperatures. So we're heading for 1.5 degrees heating by 2030, and we're heading for 2 degrees, which was the limit according to the Paris Agreement that they said this is dangerous, we mustn't go above it. We're already heading there by around 2050. And unless we take radical action now, it's not locked in, there is still time, but that is where we're currently heading, even with the policies that are in place right now. You can see that on this graph, that even with policies that we have in place, we're heading by the end of the century to around average of around 3 degrees heating. Now that is staggering. Even with the pledges and targets that the governments have promised, we're still close on 3 degrees. And look at the error, the margin. So we could actually be heading up to 4 degrees. This is just showing that the 3 degrees, heading 3 degrees by the end of the century. The pink bands are the the emission pathways that we're currently on, as opposed to the blue bands, which really would bring us down to not get to 3 degrees by the end of the century. Now, remember, this was just 1 degree, far right of this diagram, that was a 1 degree rise. Imagine that diagram with another 1 and another 1 by the end of the century. I mean, look at the comparison to how it's the stable climate that we've lived in over the last 2,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years. So what are we going to expect in the coming decades? I'd like to play you this short 2-minute video just to give you a sense of, according to the World Economic Forum, that have gathered some very good sources, the sorts of things that we could expect over the coming decades, unless we take radical action now. So I think I need to stop sharing my screen and put on a different share screen, that one. Okay. Sorry, I just need to work out where to go. Okay, I'm just going to stop that one there, because then it goes into some other things which are interesting, but not quite the theme that I want to just continue with. So I just want to show you a few more slides. So where we go back to my slides. Here we go. So just to add a few more things to that horrifying description, just a couple of more headline facts. Hundreds of millions of people by 2050 at the rate we're going will be exposed to extreme heat waves. 1 in 5 major cities heated to the point that, unlike any currently existing city. 410 million people in urban areas regularly exposed to severe drought. These are all verified sources, and all of the sources that I've talked about are in the Emergency on Planet Earth document that Emily talked about at the start. 3.6 billion people today lack sufficient water. That will soar to 5 billion by 2050. Melting glaciers threaten to put 1.9 billion people at risk of serious water shortages. Food scarcity, global agricultural yields predicted to be depressed by up to a third. 500 million small farms will be very affected. 5 billion people, that's half the global population, likely to face shortages of food and clean water, 1 in every 2 people. Rising seas could displace more than 300 million people from coastal cities, from their homes, which would be below high water level at least once a year. And mass migration, famine, and all of these things, everything we've talked about so far, it's likely, well, it's not possible, it's not certain, it's not impossible that could really disrupt the very fabric of our society, taking us towards civil unrest, possibly war, and raising the terrifying possibility of societal collapse. By 2070, 3.5 billion people living in unlivably hot places. Plus, when we've got, I'm not even going to go into this because it's a whole other topic, but then we've got the possibility of tipping points being reached at any point sooner than that, and sending us into even higher temperatures than are already predicted. So that's how tipping points come into this. If we reach 4 degrees, which at the moment is possible by the end of the century, there's a sense of panic in scientists in terms of what that might look like. And I'm going to come on to solutions in just a moment, so if anyone's getting too activated by this. So it's difficult to see how a 4-degree world could accommodate 8 billion people, or even half of that. And we're heading for 11 billion. We would be heading for 11 billion by the end of the century. And there's no certainty that we can adapt to it. It just must not be allowed to occur. Earth would become an uninhabitable hell. So we do need to do something about this. We risk damages on a larger scale than the 2 world wars, hundreds of millions of people, billions having to move. So this is an emergency. I'm not going to read out all of these because if you want to look at these slides, they'll be on this recording forever. But these are just to show you that a variety of different people, scientists, doctors, UN Secretary General, economists, IPCC head, chief rights chiefs, governor of the Bank of England, military advisors, Archbishop of Canterbury, they are all united in saying this is an emergency. So there is an opportunity to stop this, but we do have to act radically, and we do have to act now. If we want a 50-50 chance, just a 1 in 2 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees heating, which is the internationally agreed that we really ought to try and stay below 1.5 degrees heating if we possibly can, and we absolutely must stay below 2, we would need to see drastic emission cuts right now. And remember, it's not happening, they're rising. We'd need to get to net zero by 2050, and then, even then, we would then have to remove lots of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we don't even know if that's possible. At the moment, it looks like so-called negative emissions technologies to capture this carbon and suck it in from the atmosphere are just not going to cut it. They're not going to be efficient enough or good enough or stable enough to be able to do that. So even our 2050 target only gives us a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, and it depends on these carbon capture, which just isn't something we should be depending on. Even that would require radical transformation of our energy, industry, transport, building, agriculture, forestry, land use. If we want to have a 2/3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees heating, which is obviously far better, far preferable, then we need to be cutting our emission rates very, very fast. And remember, we're not cutting them. They are still going up. They've still been going up since the first warnings of climate change. over the last 40 years at least, they've been going up since warnings have been made by climate scientists, since the Paris Agreement, which said they need to start going down in order to stay below 2.2 degrees. They're still going up. Specifically here in the UK government, there's been a startling report from the Committee on Climate Change this previous summer, which showed that of the 21, so the Committee on Climate Change is an internal review that comes in and looks at the government's action on climate change. It's the government's own advisors. And they showed a staggering lack of progress. 21 indicators, only 4 were on track in terms of progress on tackling climate change. Of the 31 actions recommended by the Climate Change Committee, only 2 had been achieved. 14 showed no progress, and no sectors have demonstrated resilience for a 2-degree hotter world. The UK may say, oh, you know, our emissions are falling. They fell a little in the power sector, that's true, only because we moved from burning coal to burning oil and gas, but they're likely to go up again. Plus our terrestrial emissions, our carbon accounting, shall we say, only takes into account what's actually emitted on our home soil. It doesn't include aviation and shipping, which is a huge extra set of emissions that the UK government doesn't even sort of account for. It doesn't include emissions embedded in the stuff that we buy, that we outsource, the emissions from factories overseas, like in China, that burn the fossil fuels, give out the emissions, and then also all the emissions from shipping or flying those products here to the UK. Remember, we import huge amounts of stuff here in the UK. We're one of the biggest importers, and we're one of the biggest outsourcers in terms of our emissions. So anyone who says, well, we're doing okay here in the UK, it's not true. But the good news, and we also have the highest historical responsibility, and being a privileged and wealthy country, we owe it to less developed countries to bring things down even faster. Really, we should be aiming for net zero by 2025. And the good news, though, is that we do know how to deal with this. We just don't have the political or economic will to do it. And as the scientist Sherwood Rowland said, F. Sherwood Rowland, what's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if in the end all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? So in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I have done personally in receiving this information and some suggestions and options for things that you could do to help. So my personal journey was that once I had all of this information, I was like, I want to help other people to get this information out there. So I was one of a small group of scientists, some of whom were also on this Zoom call, who founded a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. We wrote a declaration that's now been signed by 1,700 scientists across the globe to say that this now calls for civil disobedience, non-violent direct action, in order to force governments to listen, because we've tried every other method. Scientists have been warning the world about this for 40 years in a very unemotional, impartial, without opinion way, because that's what scientists are supposed to do. It's the government that are supposed to take that information and take action, and they haven't. So I myself went out on the streets at these Extinction Rebellion protests last October, a year ago, and tried to just spread the word, get people to know the truth. We lay in the streets, we blockaded the city, and I actually got carried off by police at one point because I felt so passionately that I was prepared. I wasn't actually arrested, but I was prepared to be arrested because this is something that we have to raise awareness about. We got some great headlines. We even got the tabloids covering it, saying that scientists are on the streets and protesting, which felt really good that we'd kind of got something out there. We grew from a band of 5 of us to a band of about 20 or 30. And then by November, there were about 100 of us, and we were marching in the streets and in Trafalgar Square and giving talks on the steps of Trafalgar Square. And for me personally, the other thing that I've chosen to do, I got to work with my partner, Kinway, finally, going to protest together with him leading the Samba band and me on the megaphone. The other thing that was mentioned earlier is that together with this group of scientists who collaborated and helped and wrote some parts themselves, I've helped to get together a huge document, Emergency on Planet Earth, which is now a free online guide available on the Extinction Rebellion website, but also available independently as a Google document. So if you just Google Emergency on Planet Earth and my name, that should pop up. And myself also, a kids book that I wrote last year called Brain Fizzing Facts, I've now dedicated the second book, which is coming out in May, to helping kids understand the climate and ecological crisis and what's going on the planet. So that was my journey, but the question is, how can you help? So just in the last few minutes, I'd like to offer some suggestions. Now, of course, I was in a unique position. I already had a platform. I was already working as a science communicator. I already had a unique set of skills that made me able to take the actions I took. And I don't want in any way for anyone to think, well, you know, if you can't do anything like that, then there's no point, because every little thing that we do can help. The most important thing to do first is to realize that we just have to acknowledge that this is happening. We can't change anything until we get present to what's going on. So get informed, share this talk with people, watch it again if there's anything you didn't understand, or get in touch with me if you have questions, and read and share the guide that I suggested, or there's lots of other places that you can go to find bits of information. But as far as the scientists in the Extinction Rebellion community are aware, this is the only place where you can find the whole thing, but in an easy to read form without having to read the IPCC reports. Share it with your friends, but it's not just about finding out the information, it's then important to act. And again, this is your own personal choice. I'm just saying what worked for me, which was that to take my power and use it for positive change. So you could raise awareness, you could tell everyone you know about what's really going on, use your social media platforms, use whatever platforms you have. Make whatever personal and professional changes you can, but remember, individual action is not going to be enough. Even at the height of COVID, when everything was shut down, emissions only fell by 17%. You know, we've got to get the government to make systemic changes, top-down changes. So yes, go to a plant-based diet if you can, stop flying if you fly, use more public transport, insulate your home, switch to a green energy provider. But it's more important that we get top-down changes. So of course you can be inspirational by doing that, and you can show the government that we're willing to change by making personal changes, but we need to get it through to the government. So you can write to your MP, you can ask them to back what's called the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. This is a bill that's been prepared by an alliance of scientists and academics, launched in August 2020. And it basically sets out what the government should do in order to keep us on safer territory. And that bill needs to be passed by a certain number of MPs backing it. So write to your MP. The objective is to ensure that we try to keep heating to 1.5 degrees. I'm not going to read out everything that's on these slides, because again, if you're interested in the bill, you can come back and look over these slides to show exactly what it does. And also to conserve the natural world, to look at wildlife loss. So we have to, there's been huge support for the bill. This is from the Secretary General of Amnesty, that we need this bill to avoid catastrophe. Caroline Lucas is backing it. We're all in this together. We need to come together in our response. So what you can do is that you can find out how to contact your MP or how to back the bill on this website here. And finally, the other thing you could do, like I have done, is to join a protest group. So we could turn your fear and your anger, your frustration, your overwhelm into fuel. And as Cristina Figueres says, it's time to participate in non-violent political movements wherever possible. And civil disobedience really does work. Just take one more minute to finish this and then we'll move to questions. So if we look through history, if we look at the suffragettes, Emmeline Pankhurst being arrested, if we look at Gandhi being arrested and the hunger strikes in India, if we look at Rosa Parks on the bus in the American Civil War being arrested, I'm not saying that people have to get arrested. I'm not saying that people have to break the law at all. But I'm simply saying that when there is an unjust law, when the people in charge are not actually doing what is safe for a country or what is safe for people or what is fair or right, then in the past people have broken the law. It hasn't been popular at the time, but it has worked. Civil disobedience is a way of reminding onlookers of the possibility of not obeying. Because we are programmed to obey social norms. We're programmed to obey authority. But many times people in charge do get things wrong. They make mistakes. Often when planes crash, it's because, not often, but there have been many cases where planes crash because the pilot made a mistake and the co-pilot simply didn't speak up because they were programmed to follow orders. And there have been some horrible incidences in history. If you just look at the Holocaust, if you look at Khmer Rouge, where authority can actually make terrible decisions and people blindly follow orders. So we just need to think, how can we trust, how can we allow ourselves to think for ourselves, do we feel that what's going on the planet is right? And if not, how can we make a stand? And often people don't make a stand unless they see other people taking a stand. That's a very common psychological thing. And it's true that with climate change, all other methods have changed. We've signed petitions, we've written to MPs, we've gone on rallies and marches, it hasn't worked. So for me, protests are the way forward, because that's the only way of getting the government to sit up and take notice. Good people disobey bad laws. That is, for me, a really powerful way of looking at it. And again, I'm not inciting anyone to break the law. I'm simply saying that there are people in authority who are already saying that enough is enough and we have to do something about this. This is George Monbiot, who was arrested, saying that he decided to stand up. It was his human duty to be arrested in the defense of the living planet. Now, I'm not saying it's everyone should do this at all, or that anyone is privileged enough to be able to do this without it having really dire consequences on the rest of your life. I'm just showing some examples of what has happened. It's never popular, civil disobedience. It doesn't matter. That's why Extinction Rebellion isn't liked very much, but it doesn't matter. It's here to raise the alarm and to change the conversation, to move ideas from what was unthinkable, radical changes that's needed to address the crisis, to move them towards the Overton window, which is where these ideas become popular and then they become embedded in policy eventually. And it's already happening. Collective action puts us, changes socio-political norms, and it's already happening. Boris Johnson and John McDonnell praised the protests and the climate strikes and the youth strikes and the Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg for raising the alarm. The UK Parliament declared a climate change emergency as a result of protest groups directly afterwards. Concern for the environment is at a record high after protests such as the youth strikes and Extinction Rebellion protests. Concern for environment is now 25% of people put it in their top 3 concerns of the planet. And the UK became the first major economy to pass net zero emissions law. And then finally, in December 2019, Extinction Rebellion was voted the most influential organisation on climate change. So protest groups really do make a difference if that's the way you feel to go. A lecturer at the University of Bristol has said, we do expect to see more climate protests because they challenge the legitimacy of a catastrophic business as usual. So Extinction Rebellion protests remind people of our agency. Any protest, climate protest, taking action, it's about reminding us of our agency, reminding us that we need to do something and that this experiment with our planet needs to stop. So I've put down some links here. Again, you can see them at the end when you play back the seminar as to how you could get involved with any of these different communities. And remember, the difference between what we do and what we're capable of doing, that's all. You don't need to be a superhuman. Just what you personally are capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems. Thank you. So,
well, thank you very much, Emily, for that great presentation. We've got just over 5 minutes for questions. Just to remind everyone that if they want to send in a question, they can do it on the chat function on Zoom, or if they're watching on YouTube, then they can do it on the live chat function. I mean, just picking up on the end there, Emily, where you were starting to talk about psychology, there have been a couple of questions that, or indeed a discussion on the chat around the kind of people's psychological response to this, and the psychological response, you know, why do people not take action, and whether you've got any thoughts on that. I remember when the last time we met, we were doing a Guardian panel discussion, and there was quite a lot of talk about that on the panel discussion.
Yeah, really good question. And it's really important that we address this. So why do people not take action? So I think there's a lot of reasons. Firstly, is because we are programmed to obey authority. We're programmed to think that whoever's in charge kind of knows what they're doing. You know, even primates defer to authority. They follow social norms. And we see there's been experiments by psychologists in the past where people have been asked to actually carry out horrible electric shocks on people in the next room because someone tells them to. And if someone tells them to, they will do it. And this is natural, this is an evolution, this is to protect us, this is to help us to form communities, this is to help us to bond with our community. So we actually have to overcome our natural instinct to not act, our natural instinct to go, surely it's not that bad, or, you know, the government must have this, or the people in charge are doing something about this. Plus, we've got the fact that if we really do get it, it's likely that our nervous system might go into a state of overwhelm, a state of shutdown, a state of panic, a state of freeze, paralysis. So we've really got to, first and foremost, overcome this narrative in our head of thinking, every time we think this is happening, we go, oh, no, it can't really be, it's fine. We need to overcome that, which is hard. And the best way to overcome that is to see other people taking action, is to have other people in your community taking action, and to share how you're feeling, and to realize that other people are feeling the same way too. And secondly is to calm our stress response so that we're able to act. So, you know, taking some time every day to look after yourself. You know, it's all about sustainable planet, and a sustainable planet is all about sustainable living as well. I'm not a great example of that. I get very stressed and overwhelmed, but I'm constantly being encouraged by friends and family and support networks to take some time for myself, you know, whether that's a glass of wine or a hot bath or a walk in nature, or, you know, a football match, or whatever it is. Take some time to calm ourselves down, to bring down our anxiety and our overwhelm, such that then we can take action from a really embodied and empowered place, because that's where the difference is going to be made. Even if it's just a bit of breathing, a bit of meditation or kickboxing class, you know, do whatever it is that can help you to then act from.
Another question, I mean, at the end there, you were saying, you know, giving a list of the different things that we could all be doing, and your top number one was raise awareness. Now, as somebody who's been heavily involved in science communication, I mean, what would your recommendations be for how we can go about doing that raising awareness from the, you know, in terms of the science? The first IPCC report came out in the early 1990s, and so, you know, the science has been out there. There's been attempts to communicate the science for a very long time. What's your recommendations as to what people ought to be doing in terms of that raising awareness, particularly from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, so that's a really good point you raised, because the point is that science communication, in the two separate words, the communication of science, historically and traditionally, and in terms of what it's meant to be, is meant to be impartial, unemotional. It's meant to simply report on the facts and trust that the authorities, the government, the media, will take it seriously, will act according to those facts. And in a sense, that contract has now been broken, because the other side of the bargain has not been upheld. So what now needs to happen, both from scientists, which is now happening at increasing amounts, but also from informed members of the public, like a lot of you guys here today will be, is to be able to communicate this information, but in a way that also speaks to people's emotions, in a way that isn't just this year this will happen, this year this will happen, or but in a way that actually tells personal stories. How are you impacted emotionally? What personal stories have you seen on the news or have you read about that have impacted you? To actually talk about this in a way that isn't just bare facts, but actually talks about you know, that this is scary, that this is overwhelming, that this is potentially catastrophic to our planet. And the challenge with science communication, again, as two separate things, as opposed to science communication, is that scientists communicate in terms of risk. And they say something is very likely if it's got, I can't remember the exact figures, but about a 95% chance of happening. Now, most of us wouldn't say that was very likely. Most of us would say that's going to happen. But the point is, science can never say that's going to happen unless they're 100% certain it's going to happen. Science is never 100% certain about anything. It can't be. So everyone says, well, let's wait until the scientists are sure. That is complete nonsense. What we need to be doing is listening to the scientists, communicating it in terms from the scientists, communicating it in terms of what's known as the precautionary principle, which means we act according to the risk of what's going to happen and according to how bad that would be if it did happen. And we act according to that rather than how certain we are that it definitely will happen. So it's like, you know, if it's pretty good chance that if you get on an airplane, it's going to crash, are you going to get on the plane? No, but that's how we're reacting to climate change. We're saying, well, the scientists say it's likely, but we don't know for sure. So let's wait till they gather a bit more evidence, and then let's come back to us when you're sure. So the way we communicate, to come back to your question, is that we need to communicate responsibly in terms of we need to stick to the facts. We need to absolutely stick to the facts. We mustn't exaggerate. There's no need to exaggerate because it's bad enough as it is. But we also need to bring with that an emotive, you know, Greta Thunberg does this brilliantly. You know, she talks, you're doing this, and this is how it makes me feel, you know, how dare you, effectively.
So we've pretty much run out of time, but one final question that I can't resist asking you. So Monday was supposed to be the start of COP26, which has now been delayed for a year. We're sitting at a sort of pretty historic moment in time. It looks as though we're going to have a new US president who has a very different attitude to climate change and is committed to rejoining the Paris Agreement. Over the next 12 months, in the run up to when COP26 will be happening in Glasgow next year, what's your greatest hopes in terms of what might happen on an international stage?
Whoa! I mean, God, anything is possible. I think that's what's so terrifying but also exciting about this moment in time, is that as we come out of the pandemic lockdown, obviously we've just gone back into one, but as we seek to emerge eventually, it's crucial how we emerge, because the governments are putting so much money into reboosting the economy, and we've seen that people are willing to change. We've seen that people are willing to take radical changes to their lives. The changes that would be required for climate change are far less than any kind of lockdown, but the orders of magnitude of the damage and the risk to people and their loved ones from climate change is far greater than from COVID-19. So my hope is that as we go through this next lockdown, which is really challenging for everybody physically and also on a mental health level, that as we go through this, we start to really think about how we emerge, as and when we emerge, which I'm sure we will, how we emerge, where we put that money into rebuilding people's lives and people's businesses, and we put all that money into investing in green and sustainable future, and that we see more and more awareness of what's going on. We see more and more people communicating about this on their networks, sharing some of the links that I've shared on social media with your friends and family. We see people popping up and giving talks, even just to their local communities in their children's schools, that we see people getting on board with the fact that this is real, it's happening, the truth needs to be out there, and that we need to take action. It's not enough then just to know it, but there are many pathways through which we can act. And I would invite people to go away thinking, in your life, who you are. You don't need to be on the streets as an activist. You don't need to be getting arrested. If you want to, wonderful. But who you are in your life, what can you be doing in your own life, in your own calling, in your own career, in your own passion, that can help you to live in a way that's even more aligned with the reality of what's going on, and to live in a way that helps others to become more aligned, or that helps to make the changes that are needed to transition into the new world that we're going to need to be moving into in order to stop the catastrophe that is otherwise unfolding.
Well, thank you ever so much, Emily, for a great presentation. If you're interested in finding out more sort of practical things that you can do, then there's all sorts of events that we've got on at the festival over the next week that can give you lots of different ideas in that. And don't forget, on Monday, following up from one of the topics that Emily just mentioned at the end there, we are publishing our Green Recovery Report, which is the Cambridge Zero's view on how we can do exactly what Emily's suggesting there, look to come out of the pandemic building a greener, more resilient, more inclusive, more sustainable society. So look out for that on Monday. I'm sure that Emily would be more than happy to accept further questions on social media. If you want to ask her any questions, then she's all over Twitter and Instagram and everything else.
I was going to say that. So if you want to interact with me on Twitter, that would be great. Definitely drowns out some of the haters, because I get a lot of horrible stuff on Twitter, as you can imagine. So if anyone enjoyed this or took anything from it or wants to share it, please do tweet me at Dr. Emily Grossman. You can also find me on Instagram at Dr. Emily Grossman 1, because there seems to be another one. There is another one, actually, she's in the States. And you can also read all of the stuff from this talk in the Emergency on Planet Earth guide. Also, I'm going to be doing a family show tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, sort of how to explain, well, not how to explain, I'm going to be explaining fun facts, a lot of which will be related to climate and the natural world. And also you can read about that in my World Whizzing Facts book, which you can pre-order now. It's coming out in May. And finally, I just want to plug my partner, Kimway, who I mentioned, is doing a creative writing workshop on Wednesday. So if you've got some emotions bubbling away in terms of climate change, if you've got some emotions bubbling away, if you've got some activation, if you've got something going on and you've got lots of feelings going on, one really great way to channel that is to write and to be creative with it. So I would really encourage you, Kimway's a brilliant facilitator, I really encourage you to go along to that on Wednesday.
Well, thank you ever so much, Emily. And so, as Emily said, this is the end of this opening ceremony of the Climate Change Festival. But if you want to rejoin us tomorrow, then the next session is back with Emily at 10 o'clock, I believe, tomorrow morning, where she's got a hands-on session that's very family-friendly about brain fizzing facts. So thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, there you go. There it is. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing those of you who can join tomorrow, or the rest of others you can join later in the week. And have an excellent weekend.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Look after yourselves. Be nice to yourselves tonight. Do whatever is required to just be gentle and be kind to yourself. There's a lot of information to take in. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.